Okay. Hello there, Sarah.
Hi, how are you?
Very good, thanks. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak today. It's a really exciting opportunity, as I guess I should give a little bit of a preamble that you work obviously at Design Council, and for anyone who's in design, they will know that that's sort of synonymous with the double diamond methodology and indeed
Yeah,
design thinking. So I kind of just feel this is a really exciting opportunity to go to source and ask you not only the history of where did it all get started, but really get into the fact that this has been adopted as a design methodology, but now we see it in all sorts of other industries as well. So I would love
yeah,
to go through that whole gamut. But maybe you
yeah.
could tell us a little bit about yourself first and how you came to the role, and then what is Design Council?
Sure, yeah. I started my role as the head of programs at the Design Council in late summer last year. And before that, I worked at the British Council as the Director of Architecture, Design and Fashion, working on lots of really amazing international projects across those three very diverse disciplines, but really, I guess, exploring how you use design to understand the world and each other in a very kind of broad sense. It was really kind of making collaborations and connections through designers and through audiences who are interested in design as a way of kind of, I guess, navigating the complexity of international relationships. And using lots of formats to do that. So we had programs that looked at social impact of design, looked at the impact of using materials in different ways in different countries. We also commissioned the Venice Architecture Biennale, so lots of exhibitions, communications, lots of kind of video content. But really, I think one of the reasons I decided to leave the council was because I've been working internationally at the British Council for 7 years. It was incredible, and get to tap into this brilliant global network of the design world and really understand the kind of platforms that drive design globally. I kind of lost touch with what was happening in the UK, which was slightly ironic. So I became quite interested in the work of the Design Council, primarily because a lot of our work at the British Council had become about achieving social impact and working a bit more developmentally through design. And so the work of the Design Council, especially its work in local authorities and with government, really interested me. Became very interested in how you might use design more strategically. So for those of you that don't know what the Design Council is, it was actually founded by Winston Churchill's wartime cabinet as a way of using design, kind of drive the revive the forces of the economy after the war, and using design and manufacturing and engineering to do that. So there was this kind of council of design, industrial design as it then was established, to really kind of galvanise the design industry in the UK. I suppose since then, a lot's changed. So now our mission is still making people's lives better by design. And we do that by trying to get design used in the widest possible sense across the economy and in society. And primarily in my job as head of programs, I'm often looking to get design used in places where it's not used at all. So it's not recognised, it's not understood. Nobody knows they might even need it as a discipline. So often it's about kind of using design as a tool for kind of improving social outcomes, upskilling people who may be dealing with real complexity, tackling big social and economic issues, and introducing design into that context often really unlocks innovation. So that's kind of what I'm doing at the moment.
I mean, it's so diverse and so exciting. I think it's like, it speaks to a lot of essentially the maturing of what you would call sort of creative economies and creative infrastructure of these things, that there is that breadth and depth to your work. So I guess, for anyone listening, we'll get into some deeper questions, but I think it would still be really helpful for anyone, let's say who's still in education or just out of it. And indeed, I've worked in companies all over the world, and actually the double diamond method, sometimes they know it without realizing they know it. And so I was wondering, could you break down a little bit like how that evolved and what it means in today's context for design?
Yeah. So the Double Diamond sort of evolved out of a big research project undertook by the Design Council in the early 2000s. And a kind of group of very influential people were tasked by the then chief executive to try and find out what makes companies innovative. So what were the common tools and methods they were using to drive innovation? So it was born really out of a kind of deep conversation with a small number of kind of high-performing, innovative companies. And the colleagues at Design Council at the time spent a lot of time observing what the teams were doing, what were the methods they were using to kind of come up with new ideas and to crack really difficult problems. So they started with the research, and then they kind of used that research, I guess, to come up with a codified way of explaining what all of these different methods and tools were. So there's sort of two things that emerged out of that. There was a methods bank, so a set of tools that were available for anybody to use that were inspired by these businesses and these employers. And then the Double Diamond really evolved out of this kind of core observation that all of these people who were brilliant innovators were using convergent and divergent thinking. And that they were concentrating on, I guess, what we might call the fuzzy front end of things. So before jumping to designing a solution to a problem or designing a product, they were spending a lot more time playing and exploring and understanding the problem. And it was really, I guess, about understanding the questions you're asking. So in the Double Diamond, there are these sort of two very neat diamonds, one being the kind of explore and discover phase. I guess that was kind of the big learning from developing the Double Diamond was, if you spend as much time in the first diamond exploring and discovering the problem, the people you're working with, materials you want to handle in much more depth, if you are undoing your questioning as much as possible, you're more likely to get to a better brief, which is in the middle of the two diamonds, before we start prototyping and trying and making things happen. So really that was a kind of core observation. And it was, I guess it's been interesting because it was released under, at the time, very early Creative Commons licensing. I think that was a really, really good decision by the Design Council to do that, because it was kind of relinquishing all of this knowledge that they'd built up through this process and really understanding in more depth how it can be adapted by others. So maybe I'll try and share a picture of what the Double Diamond looks like with you. Bear with me. Can you see it?
Yay! Technology.
I feel a huge sense of achievement. So we're looking at, I guess, the 2004 version of the Double Diamond. And you can see it kind of has these two big diamonds, starting with a problem at the beginning of the first diamond. So the first diamond kind of covers these two Ds. Discover, so what's the insight you can generate into the problem? And then once you've done that, how can you then use that insight to really define the area you want to focus on? So that's the first diamond. And I guess in the middle of the two diamonds, you then get this area of problem definition. So what's the question you're really trying to answer? And how can you use all of that insight that you generated from the first diamond to really define that properly? And that's often about brief writing. And I guess the analogy we often use is a brief will often land with you from a client, from a university that's fully formed, and they want you to deliver it. But I think what designers do best is undo everything. It's all about asking questions, isn't it? Unraveling. And I think the best designers are really, really good at that, about questioning the brief, asking all the questions, undoing what people have done, and really getting to that nub of the problem. What's the real solution? What's the real question you're asking? It's sort of agitation, isn't it? So that's kind of what the first diamond's about. And then I guess in the second diamond, you've got this kind of iteration, prototyping, developing potential solutions. always going around in circles, doing things, undoing them, learning by doing. And then the theory is that once you've done that, you're able to really then deliver something that works properly. So that's the double diamond. And I think it's important to say that it wasn't invented in isolation. It was definitely sort of built on lots of systems and diagrams that had been developed by people like Victor Papanek. So it's definitely inspired by lots of work from other people. But I think it was very groundbreaking. In its intention, really, it was trying to describe the design process to someone who doesn't know what design is. That was its original intention. But I guess what's nice is that it has been used not only by what we might call non-designers, people who are not formally trained as designers, but also by the design industry to explain what design is. So it's had lots of different iterations, and if you Google the double diamond, you get millions of adaptations and critiques and ways of pulling it apart and ways of thinking about how you might reshape one diamond to be bigger than the other. So it has truly been an open source process. It's adapted and changed.
And indeed, I love the fact that you've got a reference to Papanek there, as I didn't realize he had been so tightly involved in it. But that book, Design for the Real World, I should flag up for anyone. We'll put a link in below. But that was like a huge influence on me. I think a lot of his work was also, excuse me, not just about sort of the process, but he was also equally aware of what it is like to integrate a new process into something which was the status quo. His whole book is about how to challenge, how to be a rebel, but in a way that is also, not disruptive to the point of destruction. Was certainly something I took away from the book. So I just wondered, maybe I didn't intend to get into this, but how did you find its adoption? Was it a combination of osmosis, or was it also some brute force of getting it into, industry and the wider business community, as well as just so-called designers and creatives?
Yeah, I think the Design Council in the 2000s became quite well known for a series of very high-profile challenges it conducted. Primarily, actually, I guess, as the UK government as a client. So it was doing all sorts of things, with designing schools, designing out crime, working with hospitals to better design A&Es, to redefine patient journeys, to make sure that places were working for everyone. So I guess it was probably deployed quite quickly into those scenarios and into those contexts, and used on lots of very high-profile programs to try and explain what design was and how it could impact the sector that might not know about it. I mean, the Design Council's always worked very closely with the public sector. And we have a program called Design in the Public Sector, which we've run for the last 7 years with the Local Government Association, which is basically taking teams of civil servants, of local government actors, through a design process to help them really unlock a difficult social problem. So I guess the double diamond has spread because it is usable in many, many different contexts. It's useful if you're designing a product. It's useful if you're designing a service. It's useful if you're trying to engage users or communities in the design process. It's useful to understand where you are in a process. Often I've seen it used as a way of kind of navigating people through what might feel like a confusing or difficult or invisible process. I suppose a lot of what designers do and the skills designers have, it can be fairly invisible to people. And I guess one of the reasons I think it spreads so well is it was really a way of codifying and visualizing what might be a fairly mysterious process otherwise.
Do you think, I mean, that's actually a really nice point to pick up on, is that quite often academia, it almost prides itself on the fact that it alienates the majority of people, because that allows you to command a high fee because you've invested the time in understanding the jargon and the nuance. But it's actually maybe credit to design council and the use of Creative Commons, that it really has sort of become, dare I say it, it's the point where people don't think twice. They're just like, well, yeah, of course we're going to go through a bit of open-ended discovery, and then we're going to try and focus in on things, and then we'll understand what we're doing better, so then it'll make sense to do the bit of work. I would say the only reflection that I maybe have, and forgive me for making this about me, but I do think it certainly seems to be a debate I've had with various creatives, is around the first diamond, is that without sounding cynical or an old hack, but not all industries think it's worth doing the first diamond, because it seems like a lot of staring out the windows and playing around, which I mean, I come from Lego, so of course I'm going to be a fan of play, but sometimes real world business thinks, are we sure about that? Can we not just get the data and crack on? So I was wondering, reflecting back over what is almost 2 decades, how have you felt some of these things have been successful, and where do you think it maybe needs reframing so that people do appreciate the importance of that first, let's not call it a diamond, just a first exploration.
First stage. First
stage. Yeah.
I think it is hard to convince people to spend time on that. And I guess one of the reasons Double Diamond is useful is that it visualizes why you might want to. I think we often talk about, at least to business clients, about how design is able to de-risk. And it's quite difficult, I guess, to explain why playing or experimenting might lead to less risk, because it seems like a kind of dichotomy. Actually, by spending as much time as you can in really understanding what the product or service you want to develop means and what you want it to do, it means that when you launch a product, it's much less likely to fail. So in a way, a way of, I guess, explaining why it's important is because it de-risks, it mitigates failure, it tests assumptions. So, I think many products, especially, are probably launched into market based on a lot of personal assumptions made by whoever is designing or making them. I guess what the design thinking theory says is that if you spend more time in exploration and discovery, if you kind of get your hands dirty in exploration and play, if you really understand the material you're working with, it's more likely to land. So it's a kind of subtle difference, but actually that kind of twist in language I think is really important, the idea of risk. I think it really does work in explaining why you should spend time doing that. I think, one thing, we can maybe come on to this later, I think there's now a clear need to evolve Double Diamond. It's brilliant as a foundation, but the world has changed a lot since 2004. I guess it's about the idea of kind of insight and research. And I guess meeting you, Jude, your research and your insight is by making things. I often think the Double Diamond waits a bit for prototyping, kind of waits for the second diamond to do that. I'm quite interested in, I guess, insight and research being through making and manipulation.
Well, it's funny. I never really considered in that, so we say league, but I think I've always been someone who, thinks with my hands, and I think sometimes it's you think you're very alone in that you're doing something, and then it's only when you get exposed to communities like Dyson, even startups like Sugru, and of course most recently at Lego. But you start to see, oh, I'm not alone. This is actually a valid technique, and that there are some people who will be able to sort of do a lot of, a bit like Einstein, sort of thought experiments. They can just stay in their head, and I completely use those techniques when appropriate. But sometimes when you're trying to do something which is very physical, or indeed very emotional, I feel that is sometimes worth getting out of your head, and the best way to do that I find is to build something. And I quite often deliberately build things which I'm not trying to be perfect. They're deliberately partially broken and unfinished, because I think it actually speaks to our innate ability that, if you see, it's kind of, humans have a sort of irresistible urge that if something's not quite right, if a door is ajar or a circle is not closed, we're compelled to like interact with it. So I know it sounds like a bit of a sort of like weird psychological trick, but you know, we often used to talk about this at Dyson, and sometimes we'd look at a rig and go, it's a bit too perfect, that we should maybe, you know, it's not that we'd rough it up for the sake of the discussion, but sometimes you realize actually just disassembling a few parts would facilitate discussion. And so I think I get where you're coming from of saying that if you can do exploratory modeling, vignettes, maquettes, discussion, you know, even sometimes the sheer abstraction of something. To steal from Lego, I'm sure you're familiar with it, but for anyone watching, they have a little sort of sub unit called serious play, which is where you basically have a bunch of bricks and you ask people to build basically what's going on in their head, either a problem in the company or an edification of themselves. And what's weird is that you see people go into this playful state because Lego has that wonderful legacy and brand association, so people relax. And then what the most exciting bit is that when people lift up their little model and are told to talk it through, even the most reserved people in the room who don't like to be associated as creative or any of these sorts of things, you find that they do actually fall into this rather wonderful behavior of finding themselves again. To use abstraction. And so I don't know whether that's in one of the techniques that you're working on at the minute, but I definitely think abstraction and incomplete modeling is incredibly powerful.
Yeah, and also just starting.
Yes.
I think often when people think about research, it seems like a long form way of doing something, and people want results quickly. And often a way of I guess, flipping the research is to start making something, and you know, making something halfway, half done, helps people to understand what the research is they're doing. That is the research. The making can be part of that. So I guess that's something I've been thinking about a lot recently. It's actually in the Double Diamond. We wait to prototype. What happens if you bring prototyping forward? You know, that changes the shape of the system completely.
And indeed, I think also that when people say prototype, they always assume it is a sort of nuts and bolts type thing. I think you know, we've certainly at Lego, you know, there's a phrase that we use called fake-a-type, which is maybe similar to what some other people call Wizard of Oz a little bit, in that it is not a true manifestation of the final thing, but it's able to elicit exactly the right discussions that you want to have about something. So I think those techniques are quite interesting. And I think also, as much as people get anxious whenever you say storyboarding, because it sounds like you've got to be a graphic artist at Pixar, but actually a post-it note with some stick people on it and some speech bubbles, that I feel is also prototyping the user journey, because unlike a sheet of paper, you can move the post-it notes around and you can reconfigure it. And I think people should relax about the word making and prototyping, because it's really just about what things get it out of your head and into a format that we can all engage on, and you don't have to be a so-called designer or creative to engage it.
Exactly.
I think whatever you're working on that, you know, gets the finance, the legal, the supply chain, all those people, HR, if they all feel this is easy peasy, then I think you've knocked it out the park.
And I mean, so much of our work is about getting together people who either don't know each other but are all trying to pull in the same direction, or haven't worked together before, or may appear to come from very different perspectives of a problem. So often the first thing we do is just try and get them to establish a shared vision, what they want to achieve, I guess establish a common language. You know, making and prototyping is really key to that. You know, it's a real leveler. It gets people to kind of articulate their vision in a very different way. And I guess the other thing that the first diamond or the prototyping insight research stage is just spending time with people. Often you find, especially in the public sector, people don't have the time to spend with the people they're designing for. So often the programs we run kind of gives them the time and space they need to really delve into what it's like to experience a service they're trying to design or a product they're trying to design. And just giving people that time to go out, to spend a day with somebody, to observe what it's like to try and use a service, or to try and just go day to day, trying to navigate things that are really, really challenging. The insight you reap from doing that kind of deep hanging out is really, really important for us, really, really important. And that, again, that's something can be quite difficult to make a case for. I think, you will get a better product or service out of doing that. Even if it's just one person, you will get this kind of personal connection. It will unlock different kinds of insights and innovations.
So I guess maybe within that is a good question to say what makes a good design thinker, as it were. What are the traits that, should we say? And I think I'm going to press you a little bit for the detail of what would you say are good traits at the early part of your career, but what are things that you should be saying when I gain sufficient experience, these are actually very high level skills, and work towards that if you possibly can?
Oh, that's a tough question. I think it's about that critical eye. I think that question asking. I think so much of design is about, yes, problem solving, but also problem finding. And I think as a designer, the ability to find the problem, the real problem, and then solve it is really, really, really a critical skill to develop. So I think that kind of critical questioning, empathy is so key in being a good designer. So building empathy, using your tools and skills as a designer to build empathy and relationships with people, to really understand their point of view on the world is really, really critical. I think the other thing I've been thinking a lot about recently in terms of design skills is improvisation. I think improvisation is an incredible design skill. I do think it's something that's kind of undervalued. It's quite difficult to define and to teach, I suppose, to improvise. I think it comes back to your point about play. It's about what can you use? How can you be resourceful? How can you use the assets around you to design something? I think we've been thinking a lot about sustainability, and a lot of young designers will be as well. How do you practice design sustainably? There's a lot of innovation around waste, around material cycles, particularly in the circular economy. A lot of that is about being asset-based. So, what do you have around you in the immediate vicinity that you can use to improvise? I think that that kind of manipulation of materials, that understanding of the context is really, really important. Really important. And I think there are lots of, design skills are something they've been thinking a lot about at the Design Council. We kind of define it as kind of, I guess, having three buckets, if you like. So I guess a good designer is able to sort of use the skills of the head, the heart, and the hand, I guess. That's a kind of very broad way of describing it. I guess the head skills are kind of those empathetic skills, those listening skills, those questioning, critical thinking skills. The heart is all about building relationships and really establishing those kind of empathetic relationships with people, really deeply understanding the context you are working in. And I think that's so, so important. Not designing in isolation, being open to as many perspectives as possible. And then I guess there are more hand skills, and those are the kind of fine skills you might develop by working on something for a long time. If you're a web developer or a wood turner or anything in between, it's that kind of practice and that honing and refinement of a hand skill. But it's also, again, about using that hand skill to understand the problem in more depth. I think materials, whether they're digital or physical, that kind of working with the material you have and really mastering that using all of those skills is really key.
I guess one of the interesting journeys I would imagine that designers go through, I mean, I certainly feel it myself, is that you go through this journey of actually trying to empathize and understand other people, but in doing so, you also have to examine your own biases and your own, should we say, inner turmoils and logics and justifications. As I think possibly one of the worst things that a scientist or indeed a designer can do is just be going down a route of confirmation bias, where you go, look, here is the perfect design, but truly it's a design which you empathize with rather than the end user per se. So I guess I wanted to get into the sort of the subject of psychology, and the fact that certainly my course didn't broach the subject of psychology much. It had a very brief course on marketing, which I think we share a connection with Adam Curtis's work. That I'll put a link below, but Century of the Self was very much a polemic, but nonetheless a very comprehensive exploration of the role of marketing and how it uses certain mechanisms to elicit certain responses from us, and indeed to enable us to buy products. And I guess where I'm going with this is the question is really, what do you think the journey is for a designer to help avoid some of their innate biases, and also how do they stay on an ethically sound track? As, dare I say it, they will get better at wielding their power, and as the saying says, comes responsibility, right? So
yeah.
How do you help? How might the design council help people on that journey?
No, gosh. And I don't know, another thing I think a lot of people have been thinking about recently is a really big shift in design. Is, I guess, design for a long time in the sort of public imagination was about this idea of the singular genius, wasn't it? It was about the kind of, the star architect or furniture or product designer who kind of came up with these incredible ideas and, kind of pushed them through, and they became their own personal brand. And I think one of the most interesting changes in design practice has been about the shift to the collective. And you can see it with lots of sort of young emerging practices, and certainly with my work internationally with the British Council, it was something that I observed in many other countries, that working as a collective rather than as an individual and being open to more fluid and dynamic structures in your work means that your bias is constantly challenged. And I think that is very exciting. I think it's very hard to make it as a lone genius in the world. And I think, you'll know from working on things like BBC The Fix and the Big Life Fix, actually real innovation happens when you draw on the skills of a diverse range of design disciplines. And that, it's always amazing to see, a service designer working with a product designer, the skills an architect brings or a kind of planner brings, that kind of idea of different negotiations of space and of time and of communities that different design disciplines bring, I think is incredibly powerful. And I think that that's something very exciting for the Design Council. And I think design has become such a huge industry. It's vast, and the digital means that it's kind of a never-ending field in so many senses. So I think, in a way, one thing we are all really keen on doing, and I'm really excited about, is trying to bring together these interdisciplinary design teams. Mm-hmm. When we're talking about social impact and working in places to help people unlock really difficult problems, really pervasive problems, that mix of skills is really key, really, really key. I think working in that more collaborative way allows you to have a much more discursive and critical discussion about what it is you're doing as a designer. I don't know if that answers your question.
No, I think so. I think it's just, that thing of also acknowledging there is a journey, and that a lot of it does. There sometimes just isn't a shortcut for experience.
No,
It is just having to get that diversity. So I guess one of the things I'm eternally grateful for, actually, is the British Council's involvement in, correct me if I'm wrong, the ISDA program, which God knows what the acronym was, but basically the best of technology and science and wonderful awesomeness. But it had this incredible system, and I don't know how you brokered it, but for anyone who doesn't know, for me, it solved the age-old problem of, if you're a student, you won't get an internship because you haven't got any industry experience. So it's a vicious circle. And this said, well, as long as your grades are, and I should stress, not rock star grades. I had B's and C's and D's when I was doing this. But the mechanism is that each institution says, we will accept every student who, we will accept a student for every student who is accepted elsewhere in the world. And I thought this was such an incredible use of a global network, which is the power of the Design Council, that it wasn't even saying, well, we've got this little sort of in club of we only ever work with the guys in France or Germany or whatever. It was a free-for-all. All the cards got put on the table. So even though I was in Glasgow, I got to go to Hong Kong, and that's where I actually ended up meeting my wife to be. So it was extremely significant for me. but it's one of those things where I just thought, gosh, what a service that was to the creative industry to figure up and also broker that deal. That it was safe. I didn't get into any trouble. I didn't worry about insurance. I had accommodation. I had all those sorts of securities. And I just, without waxing lyrical about it too much, I genuinely think it's one of the best things out there.
I guess in my work at the British Council, our focus really was on supporting emerging designers to have their first international experience. And I think if you are a young designer, having that total reversal or context switch is so important. And it is a real luxury to be able to travel in that way and spend time out in other countries. But by spending time out of context, by really understanding how people work in very different conditions from your own, I think is incredibly valuable as a young designer. I think the British Council has spent 85 years building trust, and that's what its business is. And I think, when you travel with them, you really feel that you're in a kind of, they broker very trusted, they're there for the long term, I think if you're talking also about the collective, I think there's also, I feel, an emerging desire to be generous from young designers. And I think generosity is an incredibly important quality in a designer. And I think being generous and allowing yourself to fail and to make mistakes early on builds up your tolerance for risk. I think you talked about what do you need to take forward if you're a more established designer. I do think it's that ability to take calculated risks, or sometimes even uncalculated ones, because that's often where best things happen. I think everyone always talks about failure being important, but it is critical in design. I think.
Well, I think I remember one of the things, because I do struggle with the fail fast mentality, because I think it implies that you just jumped off a cliff without a parachute. And I do think that there is a gap between that and planning to the nth degree that you never actually start the project. But I do think you're completely right in that sort of being as planned as you possibly can, but still having an element which is a leap of faith. I mean, Big Life Fix certainly was that. I mean, at the end of the day, you are being filmed by a team, and you really don't know whether you can solve the problem. We really didn't. That wasn't staged. That wasn't scripted. We truly did not know, and that was stressful as hell to know that you're also going to be filmed in the process of potentially failing spectacularly. But I hope that the thing that's communicated through that is that actually there wasn't an epic failure. And it wasn't because, I mean, I'd like to think that we're all very talented, but we weren't Einstein. We're not geniuses. I think I'll speak for myself. I certainly wasn't, but I think it's the thing of we all actually trusted the process.
Yeah, exactly.
You know, we trusted the notion that actually by truly understanding the problem, the brief would actually evolve. And I think one of the things that you mentioned about collaboration is that at no point did we say, "Hi there, I'm going to meet you. I'm going to disappear for 6 months, and then I'm going to post you the result, and you're going to love it, and make sure you smile and say thank you." Certainly, when I look back at my interaction with Kyle, the young gentleman who wanted to become a hairdresser, the bit that doesn't make the edit is that I probably spent about 3 months with him, just Skype calls, just getting to know him. And if I hadn't built that trust and understanding, the end result wouldn't have looked like that. So for me, that was the first diamond. I appreciate there is a necessity to make a TV program, and that's just the nature of the beast, that you want to cut to the juicy bits. But I think it's important for people early in their career to realize that first diamond is really key, should we say.
Yes. And also that first diamond can be about relationships. You know, it doesn't, as you say, it doesn't have to be about a rapid evidence review or a quick piece of research. It can be about developing and building a long relationship with somebody, and really having a deep understanding of how you might work together.
Yeah. So I guess I'm curious to know as well, we've mentioned a little bit about sort of psychology, and how I said it sort of feels like design sometimes is when I speak to people who are sort of expert in psychology or sort of medical techniques, as well as having come from a sort of empirical science background originally, I sort of think, oh, there's an interesting mashup here in design. And I think that's where I feel at home, that you can get very, very empirical, but you also are very aware that humans are humans, and they're going to do some crazy anomalous stuff. And you're just going to have to be ready for it when it comes at you. And I guess it's interesting. I don't know whether this is helpful, but you said, what was it? The mind, the heart, and the hands. I would almost, nominate respectfully, would you consider the guts, or at least a symbolic gesture of the fact that there is something reptilian, there is something sub-ego, there is something subconscious. Because you speak to any marketeer, they know that the data is helpful, but people are still going to throw curveballs when they go out in the real world. And I think design is the same. Hence the glories of prototypes, as we've just said, that you will only find out by doing those things.
And people, forgive me, I can't remember the quote, but there's a American social anthropologist, I think, that coined the phrase that people say they do one thing and then do something completely different. So there's only so much you can get from data. We're always trying to press the people we work with on that. You can do a survey, but a survey will only give you one dimension of what you're really trying to get at. Because people behave differently. It depends what kind of questions you ask them, the context you ask them in.
I kind of feel that a lot of my professional development, strangely, has not always been in design, but actually bolting on things like Psychology 101 and sort of certain processes, which I look back and think, I'm sure this is elementary, but it felt almost impossible to unlock something without that base knowledge.
I think design is a magpie profession, isn't it? It kind of takes bits and pieces from many other disciplines and sort of adapts them as tools for their own practice. And I think, I am, having joined the Design Council fairly recently, I didn't know a huge amount about service design. We do a lot of service design, and that really does borrow very heavily from psychology, from organizational theory, from management theory. You can see sort of shades of loads of other disciplines in service design. And because it isn't a kind of emerging or early design practice, it has to kind of gather and adapt tools from other places. I find that very interesting. I guess you can see that emerging in new ideas around systems, systemic design, how you design for a system, how you design for systems change. That requires a very different set of tools than many other design disciplines.
I mean, do you suppose that almost one of the benefits of having gone through that journey of creating a formalized and a template or a process, whatever you want to call it, for what is going on in a crazy designer's brain, is that it helps sort of legitimize, how the work is done. And I wondered, do you see other industries that are sort of ripe for showing a little bit, how the sausage is made? And I use that quite deliberately because it's a double-edged sword, right? I mean, if you went to some of the big marketing agencies and said, yeah, we're going to basically show that really all you do is this, 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 and this, and then you charge people a ton of cash for it, then, I mean, you can appreciate, people would be apprehensive, right? So it's unusual that you've even, in quotes, sort of got away with this with designers, you could say. But do you find yourself drawn to other industries, I guess is the question.
That's an interesting question. I mean, I've always been really intrigued by food. Your sausage analogy is very apt. I think there is so much, there's such a lack of knowledge around food and how it's made and how it's distributed and where it comes from. And there's been a growing movement that's about kind of growing your own food, thinking more locally about the systems that deliver your food, sort of more community-driven practices. But by and large, I still think the global food industry is a total mystery to many of us, probably me included. And I think it's all about knowledge. I mean, I think the double diamond, of course, it oversimplifies a very complex and messy process. But what it does is it gives people a foundation of knowledge for thinking. And I think that, even in something like the food industry, just understanding the supply chains, the food miles, the distance, the people who are involved in, bringing a prepackaged piece of food to your fridge would be absolutely fascinating. I mean, we worked at the British Council's Fashion Revolution. It's a very interesting campaign to basically give much better visibility to supply chains that govern the fashion industry. They have this amazing campaign where every year, to mark the Rana Plaza disaster, where people lost their lives in the garment factory in Bangladesh, they ask garment workers to just tell the public, I made your clothes. They are the invisible hand behind the cheap piece of fast fashion you pick up at Zara and don't think 2 seconds about. I think that idea of transparency and visibility in systems and processes, I think will become something that people want. And I think in that way, the kind of process, I guess, of making a double diamond is quite useful. But I think consumers are becoming a lot more savvy, and they'll want to understand the processes that things go through in more depth, and maybe a kind of basic diagrammatic visualization of what that is helpful. I don't know.
Yeah, I guess it's interesting to sort of consider, as you said, consumers are at the minute having a thirst for that knowledge. And I guess it's interesting because I think you sort of increasingly, I get curious about what has happened in history. And it feels like, the 60s were kind of interesting in that they were both carefree, but extremely caring about certain things. So it's interesting to think, it's not that I feel generations repeat verbatim, but it's interesting to think we might be entering another phase of saying, Gordon Gekko was greed is good, and whether this is being disrupted as saying, where is it taking us if we just keep operating this way? And I think it's always going to be in a state of flux, but I think it's kind of exciting that you're contemplating evolving the processes of the design council, because of course it's important to stay relevant, because things will have moved on even in the space of nearly 2 decades.
Yeah. And I think, if you did that piece of research we did in 2004 now, you would get a very different diagram as a result. So you might even think that one diagram could explain what's happening, because we're now tackling such complex challenges ahead of us. I think it's really vital that we really understand where innovation is coming from, what the new tools and techniques designers are using to tackle those problems.
So I guess, do you think it would be an interesting provocation to both the young graduate, but also the seasoned professional looking where to put a few chips and a few bets in the future? And just to preface this is not about predicting the future, but it's saying, how do you become more adept in dialing into signals? Which, I mean, it would probably be fair to sort of imagine there's a relationship between a lot of creative industries also track things which are financially very lucrative. So it's not unreasonable to imagine that a lot of designers have gone into things like social media and digital platforms, because there is a glut of money on that.
Of course.
So it would also seem reasonable to think, well, the quantified self, data, healthcare. I mean, I'm not saying anything that Apple hasn't already dropped a good few billion into already, so I'm not saying anything revolutionary. But it feels like once these industries get huge injections and huge values of the money, then actually they seem ripe for creatives to help redefine the experience. So I wondered, did you have any reflections or anticipations within that space that you think would be interesting to see?
So where designers might be deployed next?
I guess that's the better question. Yes, I should have asked.
I mean, I guess from the design council perspective, it's as many places as possible. I think we know that where design is used and taken up, especially by businesses, if you want to talk it from purely economic terms, they are more successful. But I guess what we're going to experience now is, you can see this in the development of the B Corps movement, is that kind of melding together of economic benefit and social benefit. And I think that's going to be a very interesting frontier for design. I think many young designers that we will know are beginning to really understand the connection between behaving and practicing responsibly and establishing a good, sustainable business. I think at one point the two things were very far away from one another. And I think now what we're seeing is that actually, I was reading something the other day in the financial press about, when sustainability becomes an economic imperative, it will succeed.
Yeah.
Unfortunately.
I hate to admit it, but it's so true, right?
So I think I think there are many, many inspiring young designers who are thinking about what their impact is on their own immediate local economies. And again, I'm going to refer back to the British Council, but I did an incredible program called International Fashion Showcase, which is about working with 16 emerging fashion and garment designers from many, many different places, from India, South Africa, Uruguay, Ukraine. I guess what I observed as a kind of broader trend, if you want to call it that, or I hate that word, is that they were all trying to bring together a local ecosystem in their work. So they weren't just designing a garment and selling it. They were designing the garment and they were bringing in local people to make the garment, to weave the fabric, and they were using a local collective of photographers to shoot the lookbook. And they were bringing musicians to collaborate with them. And what they were building around them was a kind of creative ecosystem that could be sustained beyond them as a person. And I think personally that's going to be a big change in design. I think as we try and establish stronger local creative economies, the role of the designer as that kind of linchpin that things pivot around, I think will become quite important. I think, we've been talking a lot also about the limitations of human-centered design. You could say that human-centered design has landed us in a pretty dire situation with the climate crisis. So I'm quite interested to see how designers begin to work in a planet-centric way or a planet-centered way. What does it mean when you take the human out of the middle of the equation and put the planet in the middle instead?
I think that is one hell of a way to end. So I think we should wrap at that point, because I think that I would love to see the comments that come below if people get this far. I hope they do. But if there's anything else that you think would be a great resource to build on that, where people can look to planet-centered design, obviously I definitely want to put Papanek in there as well,
yes,
because
definitely.
it still feels like that book just hasn't aged really for like 90%.
It keeps coming back,
extraordinary.
more and more reverent.
Yeah. So I think if there's anything else like that comes to mind, or indeed if you wanted to quickly say now, if there's a closing thing that you think has really reframed your thinking of late.
Oh, that's a good question. I guess be open to as many contexts as possible. I think what joining the Design Council has taught me, and I'm not a designer, hands up, I've never trained as a designer, is that you may not know where design is needed. But if you are open about the context you work in, I think the impact you can have will be huge. Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. I just think this has never been a better time to be a designer, I personally feel. It's just, there's so many interesting things to work on.
There are.
And so much potential.
There are. Yeah.
But thank you again, Sarah, for a really wonderful chat.
You're welcome. It's been really
absolutely loved it.
Jude. Thank you. Thanks for inviting me.
Indeed. Well, thanks again, and have a nice evening.
Bye.
Bye.
You too. Bye.